All right, welcome back to our final panel of the workshop. Captain Garret Pyle, Harding Fellow and founder of our LOGSTAT podcast, will be moderating for us today. His LOGSTAT podcast, not ours. Sorry. He is a native of Farmington, Pennsylvania, and he joined the Army Reserves in 2012 and served in the 630th Transportation Company. He simultaneously went through ROTC at Washington and Jefferson College and was commissioned active duty in 2016 in the Transportation Corps. He graduated with a BA in Computing and Information Studies and has an MA in Transportation and Logistics Management from American Military University. He has served at Fort Hood, Fort Wainwright, Fort Lee, deployed to Poland in support of Operation Atlantic Resolve, and in addition to his podcasting work, he is the military editor-in-chief for the Army Sustainment Professional Bulletin. Captain Pyle, welcome.
Well, thank you, Ellen. So good afternoon, everybody. As she said, I am Captain Garret Pyle. I'm your last name to hold you for this conference today. But as we're going to be transitioning over to talk about podcasting today, I know we've done a lot talking about writing and how to utilize writing, but today we're also going to be kind of talking about the podcasting side. But I really hope you're excited as I am. We have a great panel up here. It's going to walk us through how podcasting can really, give us that next step, that next edge when it comes to Army communication. So, having created a podcast myself for Army Sustainment, title, as you said, the LOGSTAT, I understand there's a lot of work that goes into it to create such a platform, but just sit back, grab your microphones and your headsets, and get ready for some great wisdom for the panel up here. Our first panelist that we're going to have today, sitting over to my left, is Major Kyle Atwell. He is a U.S. Army Special Forces officer currently serving as the Harding Project Director for the CSA. He is the co-founder and the chair of the board for the 501c3 Irregular Warfare Initiative with the podcast Irregular Warfare. Our second panelist, down at the end, is Joe Byerly, who spent 20 years in the U.S. Army and finished his career as a lieutenant colonel. In 2013, he started from the Green Notebook, a blog about military-oriented leadership lessons, which quickly became popular, attracting over 2 million visitors. Then, in 2020, he launched a highly acclaimed podcast by the same name, where he continues to interview top military and world leaders, best-selling authors, Super Bowl-winning athletes, and Grammy-nominated recording artists. And our final panelist we have with us today is Ryan Evans, who is the founder of War on the Rocks, a media outlet on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. He has served as a U.S. Army civilian deployed to Afghanistan as part of the human terrain team assigned to the British-led task force Helmand. For this panel, I developed a list of questions, some topics to kind of get the conversation going. Each panelist is going to have an opportunity to answer those questions, but the true heart of this is going to be really having that authentic back and forth dialogue that you see from listening to a podcast. Towards the end, we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A from the audience, so please hold all your questions to the end. But without any further ado, let's get ready to rock and roll. And I'll start with Major Atwell, and this is going to be for all of you, to kind of tell us your story on how you got into operating a podcast.
All right, thank you. My two co-panelists will be very bored because we actually ran this play at the AUSA conference, which is why Ellen asked us to come here again, because it was not a televised one, and I don't think most people in the audience were here, but they've heard this story already. So I was a grad student at Princeton University while my wife and I were living at West Point because I was going to become an instructor there, and she was already a TAC officer at West Point. And it's about a 3.5 to 4 hour commute between the two locations. And I had never listened to a podcast before. And so I had two simultaneous things happening. One, I was really fucking bored on my car rides. And so I started exploring podcasts as an option to do my own professional development, and found absolutely nothing of interest to me, particularly as a special operations officer who was doing a PhD focused on irregular warfare topics. The closest thing I got was like former SOF operators talking about their favorite guns, which didn't scratch the itch, or very macro strategic geopolitics type analysis. The second thing is I was in a classroom with my buddy Nick Lopez, who was another special forces guy. And we came out of a class on international development, and we had to read these dense manuscripts that were like multisyllabic words, if you can imagine it. There's no AI cutting it down to like smaller words. Sorry, Ellen. And there were regression tables. You had to be able to like read numbers. And it was incredibly dense. And yet we walked out of one class where we came out of a discussion with a professor named Melissa Lee, who's absolutely exceptional. And we both said, man, if I had just had that nugget, the core nugget of truth out of that dense paper we read as a special forces captain, I would have been better at my job. And so the challenge became, how do we get this important information, which is often impenetrable, even if you aspired to be an active reader as a military officer or a soldier, you often have like a stack of books accumulating that you never get to. And so the medium became podcasting, right? The idea was we can bring that same substantial information. We don't need to water it down or make it less substantive, but we can just cut to the points that are relevant to practitioners and policymakers. And they can listen to it during their workout. They can listen to it on their 3.5 to 4 hour commutes. And so that was the genesis. You know, we wrestled with issues like we're supposed to be quiet professionals. So what's the difference between a quiet professional and silent professional? There's a lot of issues we had to kind of wrestle with in our heads. But that was the end state, was there's really good ideas that are written out there through branch journals, through academic journals, through books, but they're not always accessible to the people who actually need the key nuggets, the key takeaways. And so a podcast is just another means, certainly not the only one, but another means to deliver that information to busy people.
Thank you very much, sir. Move down to Ryan.
Thanks for having me here. And just a quick shout out to AUSA. You know, I might be a little biased because I used to be a civilian, and best boss I ever had was an Army officer. But I do think AUSA kind of stands alone among the service associations. No offense to the friends across the street, Navy League and other places, but just because it does events like this and so much in the professional development, educational mission that they take seriously. So it's always a pleasure to be here. After I got back from Afghanistan, I felt like what I was reading online was not that interesting anymore about not just the war there, but a lot of defense issues. And this was, I got back in 2011. So 2011, 2012, this was kind of the height of the clickbaitification. Those of you who are old enough will remember this is when everything became listicles, and even Foreign Policy magazine started publishing ridiculous listicles. And I just felt left behind and wasn't learning that much from what I was reading, but I was learning a lot from friends and mentors, usually in conversations over drinks here in Washington and London, where I was also spending a lot of time. And I wanted to bring these to a larger audience. And I went to London and I was talking with my friend Ray, who worked with me in Helmand, and we're walking around and I'm like, I want to start this podcast, I think. But I feel like, bring the conversation over drinks thing forward, but I feel like booze and war is a little too irreverent. And then Ray's just immediately said, why don't you call it War on the Rocks? And so I said, Ray, I'm taking it. You're never going to see a dime. And then that became the podcast. It started as a podcast and then a publication from there. So it's been a great journey ever since.
So my story too begins with coming back from Afghanistan. It was 2020. I was having a beer with a friend, and that's where all great ideas come from. And we were having one of those conversations of like, where do you see yourself? What do you want to do 5 to 10 years from now? And he told me he wanted to be an audible narrator. Like that was his goal. And at the time, I had From the Green Notebook. It was just the blog. And so I was like, man, I could help you out. Like you could buy all the equipment, I'll pay for it. And, we could start a podcast and you can host. I'll jump on every now and then. And then this will get you started. What I didn't know is he's one of those guys that will go out and buy like the Peloton, but then it'll just sit in his house like for years after, or it'll become like a clothes rack in the house, or like he'll be one of those guys that like really gets into weightlifting, will buy all the supplements and they'll just sit in his cupboard. So anyways, I was like, yeah, let's do this. And so we started the podcast together, From the Green Notebook. And the first several episodes were amazing. We interviewed General Votel. We interviewed Corey Shockey. We interviewed Wes Schultz, the lead singer and founder of the Lumineers. We interviewed Adam Robinson, who founded the Princeton Review, and Shannon Polson, one of the first female Apache pilots. And then we started like getting into some friction. And we interviewed a Hollywood actor, and I was like going deep with him. I was like, hey, you really love acting. You really love your kids and your family. Like, how is it being away for months at a time on set, like doing something that you love and leaving them behind? And so like we started going deep in the discussion. And then my co-host asked him, does being a leading man mean you're in charge of everybody on the set? And I started realizing that this guy has no idea what he's doing. And so I then was like, hey, we're going to need to like collaborate a little bit closer on questions. I didn't want to research any of the guests, put in the work that goes into preparing for a podcast. And so he just called me one day and he was like, I quit, just out of the blue. And we had all these interviews lined up, and that was 8 episodes in. So since then, I've done 161 episodes. And just found that like having discussions with people, meeting new people is just, and doing the research on people is so much fun. And that's why I'm continuing to do it, several years later.
No, I think it's great how each of you have this unique story, and it all comes from this desire to have an outlet you can learn more from. Like, and you found like, okay, it's not out there. Let me get out there and make it myself. And that kind of gets after my next question is like, how do we use podcasts to amplify our messages or our articles? And I think each of you had a unique story on how you did that, but if you could tell us more.
Yeah, I think the thing that's beautiful about a podcast is you can make a radio show for a very niche community that nobody else is servicing, right? Like LOGSTAT is an example. And you don't really need to have a large audience. You just need to have the right audience for that podcast. We were just discussing out in the hallway with Cole. Is Cole still here? Yeah, so he's the new editor-in-chief of the Irregular Warfare Initiative. And a couple of our articles, we don't have like a huge readership. It's not like millions of people, but we have multiple, like just this week, a senior service leader read an article and sent it out to all the relevant stakeholders within his branch, and separately made it into one of the intelligence briefing books that goes to senior leaders, right? Like, we need to have the right audience. And I think that's what a podcast can provide for various communities if you can do it right. That didn't answer your question though. What was your question? I was more following up on the last one.
No, you're good. So how do we utilize podcasts to amplify our messages?
Yeah, I think that depends what the message is, but I'll just speak to this community in here, and particularly the branch journal editors, which, by the way, I think we should caveat, this is not an encouragement for you to go start a podcast, because we'll definitely get into all the downfalls and the challenges associated with it. It's something you need to be very deliberate about. But at the end of the day, this goes back to the theme we talked about yesterday, which is everybody consumes information through different means. And you're making a lot of assumptions if you think clicking submit or clicking upload on an article you just spent 3 months editing and it goes on your website is going to reach all the people who actually need to read it. Because some of those people might consume their information through social media exclusively. Some of them might get e-newsletters in their email, and they go through that every morning. That's actually what I usually do. I get most of my news through like the Wall Street Journal Top 10, the New York Times, whatever. And I just and the Real Clear Defense and all these things. I guess some people just scroll the internet for interesting articles on topics they're interested in. And then some people do podcasts. And by the way, even if you do podcasts, anybody know what the #1 platform for listening to podcasts is right now? YouTube. Yeah, I think we talked about that. IWI still doesn't put our podcasts on YouTube, right? So even like we're falling behind on this. And so I think the way you can leverage a podcast is actually a broader conversation about amplification at large. If you've spent months working with an author who's poured their heart and soul into an article for, ADA or engineer or military review or whatever, and you hit submit, you're probably about 70 to 80% where you need to be. The last 30% should be reserved for making sure that same well-developed, empirically supported argument makes it to as many people as possible by meeting the customer where they're going to receive information. The podcast is just one answer to that, but I think each of the branch journals should do an analysis of their particular community where they receive information. And I'll just give one more plug. General Dubik pulled me aside yesterday and was reflecting on his time as a battalion commander and a brigade commander, and said, hey, really the key people that you want to get a lot of these articles to are battalion and brigade commanders, because they'll disseminate an article for that branch down. There's actually not a lot of them in a lot of branches. It could be anywhere from 3 to 12 to 20, whatever it is for your particular branch. but sending articles to those people will have a huge potential impact on your force, much better than doing 1,000 social media tweets or whatever on an article if that's not what your audience consumes. So I think the key takeaways is have a deliberate amplification strategy to meet your target audience. For IWI, the podcast is our most powerful tool because that's where we can reach our designated target audience, but it wouldn't be for every audience.
Yeah, I agree with everything Kyle just said. The only thing I'll say is, I'll be brief, is in that medium particularly, be authentic. Be yourself. Don't try to act like someone else. Don't try to put on a face. Don't dull it down. Have personality. You should let your personality shine through, and don't overly script yourself. That's the only advice I'd give there.
Yeah, it was really interesting. 2020 is when I started the podcast. So 7 years after I started the blog, and I think by then we had like 1 million views and stuff like that over the years. And what's interesting is when I started the podcast, people were coming up to me. And it was like From the Green Notebook was a brand new thing. And then I realized that these people don't read. They just listen to podcasts. And so, and even now, like within podcasting, like what we were talking about, YouTube and videos. For example, I interviewed General Donahue this past summer, released the episode last week, took a 30-second clip of that interview, put it on Instagram, and within a week, over 122,000 views. And I picked up another 900 followers. For a 30-second clip talking about PT. And so, with podcasting, it's a great way to amplify what's in the journals for people who don't read. The job that I work in, my day job, is I work for the Daily Stoic. We have an audience of 1 million people. 500,000 people get our email every single day. And then 500,000 people listen to Ryan read what we send out in that email every day. So a challenge or something to try out with the journals is read an article that you have and make that a podcast episode, and just see if that's a way to get your message out to a larger audience. Because like they said, there, a lot of people who submit to the branch journals, they do put a lot of time and effort into doing it. And it kind of sucks when it's a very small splash. But I think you could amplify that message by having somebody read that journal article, kind of like what we do with the Daily Stoic, and pick up a whole new listener base.
So kind of will tie in to the way I want this conversation kind of transition to is really what the future is. I think Joe, you just kind of highlighted a great way to use podcasts, especially as an entry for just reading an article and getting that information out in a different platform. So gentlemen, what do you see is the future of podcasts for communication with the Army? And I'll leave this open to who wants to take it first.
I think the sort of big question is, in our community specifically, is how much video is going to matter. It does matter, but I think sometimes people over-index on, well, I have to videotape my podcast like it's a comedy podcast or like it's something. And I don't think our community, this is my hypothesis, actually wants that as much as like people that want to watch their celebrities podcast because they're celebrity or they're famous, they're telling jokes. Also, when you videotape your podcast, you're limiting yourself on post-production. So if you want to snip things, if you want to get rid of someone's stutter, I think that you're making that a lot harder if you're doing video. And then the other thing is, there's a lot of stiff people in our world, and they get stiffer when you put a camera in front of them. And so they're a little more relaxed when it's just a mic. But I think it'll come down to format. I'm coming from a show that's very strategy focused, and for people talking about PT, I could see it'd be different. No one ever gets tired of talking about PT. It's crazy, but I think for things that have a more physicality, or it's like going to be a viral topic beyond people that just care about the Army or whatever, it might make more sense. But
yeah, sure. So I think not just for the Army, but the future of podcasting in general, and I would say also even e-newsletters and things like that, is smaller, much more specified, much more committed audiences. When we started the Irregular Warfare podcast, for example, we were one of one, and the field wasn't as crowded because it was right before COVID. In fact, we were supposed to record our first episode like the day after COVID restrictions started happening. And we learned quickly that we would become a remote podcast, which was not our initial plan. And I'd say that we had a much more rapid growth in the beginning. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there wasn't a lot of competition. I think there's been a proliferation of competition since then. And there's a temptation as you do podcasting. I don't know if you guys have felt this as well, it might be a little bit different, but it's a temptation to gravitate toward the things that, might get you a one-off of more downloads. So for example, anytime we do an episode on Ukraine or China, we automatically have a surge of downloads because it's like the hot topic of the day. But actually, what I suspect happens is you start losing some of the core constituency that makes that tight community that is going to be your long-term followership. And so, I think actually not trying to chase the purple dragon, as one of my ranger buddies used to say. I actually never know what that meant, but he always said, don't chase the purple dragon. Drug use, abuse. But anyways, I think identifying what your core community is and then keeping that audience small, tight, and highly loyal is probably what podcasting is. And actually, I think that's when it comes to the branch journals. If there is a way to do it so there's longevity, which we'll talk about in a minute, the branch journals are a perfect community for podcasting because there aren't a lot of major outlets that are going to have a Army logistics podcast that they're going to put out there, right? But there's definitely a core group of Army professionals who 100% would be interested in listening to that podcast. And so if you can have the bandwidth to do it, I think that's what the future of podcasting looks like for the Army, but also just in general.
Well, I think you're discounting the impact of the logistics one. I mean, I see it outpacing Rogan eventually. So I'm a little more bullish on Garrett's podcast.
I'm just one step away.
Man, offering up compliments today. I'll just say this too, there are I've seen it just in the last couple of years, and I'm sure Ryan has too, and Kyle, but there's things that are hot topic for the moment, or a trend that's happening. My big thing is just stay consistent. And I think what's really interesting, if you were to go back and look at the journal articles that were around when General Dubik was a junior officer, or the stone tablets when General Smith was a junior officer. But if you were to go back and read those journal articles, and it's really interesting that even though the technology is changing, we're still trying to solve the same problems over and over and over again. And so I think whatever you do is just stay consistent at it. And just keep bringing this stuff to a level of consciousness for people to think about. Because I think we in the Army, we move up and then we move out, we move on, and new people come up into those positions. We're constantly relearning the same lessons over and over again. And so I think it's just really important for everybody in this room to keep finding ways to bring these problems, to bring these solutions, these ideas to the top of people's consciousness, and to stay consistent at it. The one thing that you don't want to do, and I think this is why From the Green Notebook and the War on the Rocks and Irregular Warfare Initiative have been so successful over the years and are still around, is that we've stayed consistent in what we do. And we're not changing aisles at the grocery store every time there's a new trend that's hot for the moment. We keep doing and showing up. And so I think that's something, as you're testing things out, is try to stay consistent in what you do and just don't jump on something because you think it's hot, because it could go away in a moment and then you've lost all your work.
I'll add something to that because this is, I think, one of the most important pieces of advice I got when I was starting a podcast, which is if you do start a podcast and it's successful, you're going to have a lot of challenges pursuing the thing that you do really well. And this is quadrupled in the military, where everybody who is above you in rank is going to hijack the platform and shape it toward whatever their priority is for that day. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical of our ability to have effective podcasts over long periods of time in the military, because once it's established, I can promise you some person above you in the chain of command is going to decide to take it over. And I'll give an example of this. When we first decided to start the Irregular Warfare podcast, Nick and I decided that nobody cared about what two SF captains had to say, especially since we actually never have mentioned that we were in SF or in the Army at all in the podcast, to maintain that quiet professional thing. And we needed some institutional credibility. So we reached out to a whole bunch of organizations. We ended up with Princeton and MWI as our partners. But we reached out to SOCOM and we sent just an email, hey, would anybody be interested in partnering on a podcast? And the first response had like a 1-star general CC'd on it. And they were like, yes, we're definitely going to do this. And then the 1-star said, yeah, we'll make the first 10 episodes about soft ethics. And I was like, whoa, dude, that sounds so boring. Like nobody. And then, but that was a hot topic at the time because we were having issues after Tongo ambush in 2017 and all this like ethics stuff. And we made the determination then that we would never actually build a podcast that had any kind of government oversight because that's just the way of it. Now, you've carved out a spot for LOGSTAT, and I'd be curious to hear your insights on the panel about whether there is longevity there, if it's going to get hijacked. We built a podcast in the social science department where, because I knew this insight, I was able to like negotiate that editorial freedom, but it was a very deliberate effort and I had to fight for it. But it's something you'll need to be aware of if you decide to start a podcast, that you need to, if it's successful, you actually might have bigger problems than if it's not successful.
I would say that's actually one of my fears right now, actually, sir, is like I've put so much work into this podcast this year and a half now, and I don't want to see it die. I've had so many people ask me, so you're going to take it with you and you PCS this upcoming summer? And I wish I could. And thankfully I know my replacement, and I've been, communicating with him, and he's going to be able to carry that torch on. But it's just like you said, it's like we have that oversight. So somebody down the road could just say, no, we want to change the direction of that. And that, it sucks to think about because I put so much work into it. And thankfully where I'm at now, my chain of command gives me so much freedom over this podcast. Like they let me run with it on the topics I choose, the guests that I choose, how I want to run it. And they've been fully behind me on that. But not everyone's going to have that. And that could change in a moment's notice very easily. So it is definitely a fear of mine, having started a podcast, as you said, with government oversight and everything that we've put into this. Like when I know I'll be recording the 40th episode tomorrow. It's like, wow, I can't think I've already done that many episodes, and it's just been a year already. And I don't want to see that lost right now. And another point on our question right now is,
I think that you guys are raising an important issue. And is the next episode you're doing on sustaining the invasion of Greenland? Is that no? Too soon?
You have to tune in to find out.
Yeah. The real problem for all of our shows is succession. I've been hosting this since 2013. By the end of this year, I won't be hosting War on the Rocks anymore. I don't know who's going to be it. If you got any ideas, come talk to me after. But you got to transition because I've created this thing, and it's still haunted by the what happens if Ryan gets hit by a bus problem. And we're working really hard on institutionalizing everything at War on the Rocks, so that problem first becomes less severe and eventually goes away. And one of them is handing over the podcast. But that's tough, right? There's a lot of risk there because people are used to a voice, a personality, a focus, and unspoken ethos, the way you think about whatever it is that you're talking about. And when that changes, that comes with a lot of audience risk and institutional risk and lots of things. But it has to eventually happen because we can't live forever. And someone probably, in my opinion, shouldn't be hosting a podcast as long as I have. It's got to focus on other things. But curious what you guys think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not going to name names, but I'll just name like a position. But before I retired, I got a phone call that said a guy named the Chief wanted to take over from the Green Notebook and make it an Army, part of the Army institution. And what I've learned is that because people constantly come and go, you may get a passionate person in the seat, 1 or 2 goes, but then you're going to get somebody that just got a tasking for it. That's not as passionate as all of you are in here for it. And so I would say that whether it's a podcast, a journal, or whatever, that time period that you have, if you're renting it from the institution, is do everything you can to make it the best you can. And leave your mark on it, because it may not be what you made it 2 or 3 people down the road. And there was something called company command.mil, platoon leader.mil. And it was like it was like before blogs. It was what every junior officer went to in the United States Army to learn. And they handed it over to the institution to take over. And it's still a great organization, but it's a shell of its former self. And but blogs ended up becoming spinoffs of it. So I would just say that like it's going to happen. LOGSTAT podcast will. Sorry, man. It's going to evolve when you leave. But the fact that you've done such a great job with it and made it what it is, like that's the best you can hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just respond to Ryan on this. We've probably had about 25 or 30 hosts for the IW podcast over the last 6 years. And what I have learned is it's extremely difficult to find a talented podcast host. It is extremely difficult. It's not just, reading scripted questions to somebody. It's interacting with them, understanding the content, dragging out a conversation to get to the right endpoint, understanding the audience and make sure you're going in that direction, cutting down jargon. When the world's most famous ambassador talks for 60 minutes straight without a break, having the guts to cut him off. Not that ever happened in the 6th episode I ever recorded. And so it's like a very difficult skill set. And most of the hosts we brought on were extremely talented human beings, but they didn't necessarily have that skill set. And to the point, to reflect on what Ryan just said, I didn't podcast for about a year and a half because I was busy arming. And the team had blown up to too many people and it wasn't working and our numbers were aggregately going down. So like I don't get too spun up over like one episode being high, but when you look at a trend over time of a decrease, and what I had to do a couple months ago was remove everybody but 2 people on the team and then take it over again, right? And I need to end up like Ryan because I cannot podcast forever. But it's extremely difficult even when we have just people that we select who raise their hand and volunteer to do this. Like they volunteered to do it and we still can't find super talented people. In the Army, you're going to get your assigned best friend and just hope that they happen to be that person that's not just passionate, what Joe said, but also talented.
So definitely one of the things where like, I know, as you said, Joe, I'm going to have to go away. It's always hard because, I put my heart and soul into this podcast, building it from the ground up. And what I want to get into today, especially for those out there who are listening to this and thinking, okay, how do I even get started? I have an idea. I think it's a good way. Maybe my branch has the bandwidth to do this. So there's a couple different questions, but I guess my first one would be like, how do you go about choosing topics and guests for a podcast?
Okay. So the first podcast that we released, the first episode, was released in May of 2019. Was that COVID year or was it 2020? Yeah, 2021, right? Like 2020-1. I don't know if you guys have heard that. Anyway, we started planning that in November. So it was a 6-month turnaround because we were extremely deliberate about what the structure would be, the target audience, what our first episodes would be. And I think that was right that we took that amount of time to prep, because if you rush into it, one of the interesting things about podcasts that I learned a couple years in is that some people just start shows from episode 1, even when the podcast has been around for years. So episode 1 is your chance to hook a lot of potential listeners. They don't always go to the most recent episode. And so I really have 3 things that I would start with when you're thinking about building a podcast. So luckily, we've already addressed most of them, so I can keep it kind of short. The first is you have to be very clear about who your audience is, which we talked about in the context of writing. 100% true in podcasting. Colonel Stedman likes to use the term avatar, which I 100% agree. I've used the same thing. Who is your avatar, which is like the person that you are trying to speak to? And then you as a host, like what is the avatar that you're representing to that community? The second thing, and this is one I think is the most important, is you should have a standard structure, in my opinion, for what the podcast episode is. And that structure should inherently help you succeed at communicating interesting information to your audience. So I'll just give you the secret formula for IWI. We like to bring on senior general officers and diplomats, right? It turns out, though, that senior general officers are really boring because they have talking points. And they like to stick to their talking points. No offense, gentlemen. You're very interesting people. And so the question is, how do we have substantive conversations with people who probably had a prep session with their PAO beforehand and already have their talking points? And our way to break that down was to pair them with a scholar or researcher who wrote a book or an article on the exact same topic we're going to talk about, because that person will say exactly what they're thinking. They're not inhibited. And when that person who, studied this thing for 5 years and wrote a leading book on it pushes the senior officer on a thing, you actually start getting interesting insights. They actually start reacting interestingly. Like the structure of the podcast enables it to be successful for our audience, not just relying on having really talented hosts that can draw that information. Now you need to have the talented hosts as well. And so, actually Colonel Stebbin and I were talking about that last night because it's a new podcast that he's developing. Like the structure, there's lots of ways to design a podcast. Personally, I hate one-on-one podcasts, and I almost never listen to them. But I do listen to podcasts that bring interesting combinations of people together, and there's clearly some new information that'll be revealed in that conversation because of that combination. And then the last part of that is people will try to tear apart your structure. So just to go back onto this, like protecting the structure conversation we had earlier, when the podcast I started for social sciences department started doing well, and they started getting lots of downloads, it turned out there was a big donor to the social department who had written a book who really wanted to come on the podcast, and it would have been awful. And it's kind of awkward to tell your senior rater, hey, that guy who gave a whole bunch of money to us, like, can't come on the podcast because remember you promised me I had editorial control. That's like a pretty bold move to do as a person who was still hoping to become a battalion commander at that point in time. And then the last thing, so know your audience, have a structure that sets up success. And then the third one is like talent, which we already talked about. But man, talent is like probably a lot harder than you think it would be going into it. It's my personal experience. And it sounds like you guys have had the same experience with that.
I'll just say, just quick story, then I'll answer the question. It was funny. I was a battalion commander, and the DCG of the Corps came up to me and said, the Corps commander wants to come on your podcast. And what was cool is, one, From the Green Notebook is not an Army institution thing, it's mine. And two, it already made the decision to retire. And so I just told him, just tell him no. And so I didn't have the Corps commander on the podcast. But when you do have a podcast, it's really interesting. I don't know if you guys found the same thing when you first started, but if any of us in here were having a conversation afterwards and we were just talking, there's like awkward pauses in there. There's times where like, if Mike and I are having a conversation, or me and Drew, I'm in the back of my mind, like, okay, what am I going to ask Drew next? What am I going to ask Mike next? Like, and so there's like some weird pauses. There's like some weird things where the conversation goes a completely different way, just for no reason when you're having one-on-one conversation. If you do that in a podcast, it makes it hard for the listeners to listen to the show. And so like, I don't script the show out, but I have the themes ahead of time that I want to get after in this show. And then I will have questions written down that answer that theme for that show. And a lot of times it's, if I'm interviewing an author and I really like their book, I want to cover the highlights of their book. And then by having that, you can kind of move around. And the other thing is to pay attention to time. Like you were talking about, Kyle, the ambassador who spoke for 15 minutes straight. Like that matters. If you have a 1 hour block of time with somebody and they're talking in 10, 15, 20 minute spurts, you've got to be able to jump around your questions to what I call like landing the plane successfully to close the show down. So it's really important to show up prepared. When I first started, I thought you could just have a conversation with somebody, and that is really hard to do if you don't put in all that prep work ahead of time.
I don't have too much to add, although I disagree with preparation. I honestly rarely ever prepare for any episodes that I do, and I think
but you're right,
it makes for a more fun, natural conversation. But it just depends who you are and all that stuff. But I loved both the answers that they gave, so I'll just pass otherwise. I didn't prepare for this either.
Can I just say, like one of us is going to leave depressed that his podcast is going to be destroyed, and the other two feel like we worked too hard for a lesser product? Maybe, I don't know.
So at this time, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So open it up to you all.
Hey, gentlemen. This question's for either three panelists or any of you guys. With as big as short form media is right now, pretty much as big as it's ever been on platforms like Instagram, Instagram Reels, and YouTube Shorts, and so many people are consuming short form media. Do you guys see it as essential to the success of a podcast, like in this day and age, to be publishing like relevant clips on social media via short form media, or is that not necessarily important depending on the audience?
So that's a good question. I'd say not for the podcast, but we are going to be making a push into those kinds of formats, but more like mini documentaries and short conversations and briefings kind of a thing, because, people your age are consuming so much of their content that way. And so we gotta you know, I was young when I started War in the Rocks. I was 29, I guess, and now I thought that was young anyway. Now I'm 42, and you know, you got to start recruiting new readers and going to them where they are. The trick is doing it in a way that's still grounded and serious and informed and expert driven. But we're going to be making some investments into that this year.
Yeah, I think this goes back to meet your audience where they are at. Don't expect them to come to your content. IWI has like two people we pay: the person who files our taxes, because I don't want to go to jail, and our social media manager, who doesn't do short form video. They only do text and images. The investment in the social media manager has led to significant returns on engagement, followership, downloads. And we made the decision, because we're like a small nonprofit run by a bunch of people who have full-time jobs, to take our limited resources and invest in like a short form video social media manager this year as well, for the exact same reasons I suggest that Ryan's making that same decision. It won't change the core content. And actually, because our audience, like, we have a very specific demographic who like is like when my mom and dad listen to the podcast, they had given me the same response as, I have no clue what you guys are talking about. So like we've already binned ourselves into a certain demographic with that is probably okay with longer form, but still the ability to hook people who are doom scrolling is probably important, and then hopefully they go back to the long form content.
I think it's very important, and the thing is like you have the content, especially if if you're using Zoom or Riverside. Or you're doing an interview and you've got your iPhone set up, you've got the content there, and so might as well use it. There's a great program called Opus Clip AI. You upload your video to it, and then it will give you 20 like AI picked clips that already have the subtitles and everything. All you have to do, and there's editing. You could do AI enhancement with the voices. If it was like a loud background, you could put your logo on it. You can clean up the audio. You can take out all the ums and all that stuff, and it takes like maybe 10 minutes to do. And then because I have to do a lot of this stuff by myself. And then I'll just throw it on Instagram. Again, I think it's just if you have the content anyways, just take the few extra steps to try to reach people where they're at by repackaging it in a different form.
Hi, my name's Tom Spar. I'm from the Army War College. You guys talked about this a little bit but I want to hear a little bit more about how you prepare for these things. Do you meet with the people before? Do you send them the questions? How much time and energy? I know Ryan doesn't do this at all, so I guess it's for the other two, three rather. How much time do you put into it? Do you send them the questions? Do you meet with them? Just kind of what is your deliberate process for preparation for these things?
If it's an Army senior leader, I will actually try to meet with them or their team to find out what their story is, because you just never know. Someone may have an amazing story, like General Smith. Him and we talked a little bit before, and I found out like about his life background and how he emphasizes the importance of the village you create around yourself. I was like, oh, that'll be a great thing to dive into on the podcast. So if it's like somebody that you don't know a lot about, that doesn't have a lot of written work out there, I like to try to figure out what angle I can take on the show that I think would be interesting for people. Otherwise, if it's an author, like right now, the former president of Tesla is coming on the show next month. And so I'm reading his book called The Algorithm right now. So however long it takes me to read a 250-page book is my preparation for the show. I don't. The only people who want questions are Army senior leaders, and they all get vetted ahead of time, and then I just do something different once we get in there. But like that's it. Everybody else, especially guys like Ryan that have done this quite a bit, they just like show up cold, and it ends up becoming a really great show because they can just move on a dime.
I will just say a couple things on this. Is one, I never share questions in advance. If people ask, I'll share topics that I'm going to ask about, but I don't even know what I'm going to ask. So it's impossible for me to share questions. And it's also not an authentic conversation then, because then it's scripted and it feels like a press release. The one other thing, though, I'll say about senior leaders, what we discovered is they do, not all of them, but all these episodes tend to be the least interesting because they have jobs, and it's not to knock on them, but they are in political positions. If you have a star on your shoulder, it's not as easy to just say what you want and what you think. But one way of dealing with that is I always insist on either meeting them in advance in person or getting there and like being working time into the schedule where we have time to talk for at least 20 minutes face to face. And that is to do one very simple thing, is just to get them to loosen up, because people can hear on the mic, you know, the saying the camera adds 10 pounds, you know, microphones, when it's all only audio, it really emphasizes personality, tone, mood, energy. It really blows those things out. And so putting a face to the name, getting to know each other a little bit, they end up more engaging, more relaxed. You feel like you know each other a little bit more. It just turns out to be a better episode.
Yeah, so my process is a little different. Every episode is based on a published piece of academic research, and that's kind of our hook, right? And so scholars, when they write these things, one, they may have actually written it like 10 years ago and then finally made it through the publication process, so they don't necessarily remember all the interesting stats and stuff that they provided in there. But the way we go about it is we have to read that thing. And I'll tell you a pitfall that I saw some of my co-hosts doing who are no longer with the show, is they leaned in on AI, and Ellen would be very happy to hear this, to essentially give them a summary of the book, spit out 5 or 10 questions I should ask them, and then just all read those questions. And it led to just terribly inauthentic conversations, because when somebody says something, you can't push back on them or explore deeper because you didn't actually understand the material. And so people who are outsourcing AI, outsourcing their thinking, it became really obvious in the podcast hosting game. I would say we don't try and do a pre-call because often people are too busy for that, but we do, and this is like a little thing, but it's really important. We do a communications quality control check. Sounds like a little thing, but every time we don't do it, it's a catastrophic mistake. Especially since we're talking with senior military leaders who often need a dirty line of internet to actually be able to log into the virtual recording studios that we use. They can't do it on like NipperNet or whatever green they're using. But then the most important thing, to build on the different techniques that my colleagues use for how you send questions, is I send 5 general topics we're going to discuss. And then I say, this is a glide path. You will not get verbatim questions, but we're going to bounce around in this bucket for probably like 5 to 10 minutes. And I always say like, hey, I need you 2 to interact with each other, or you 3 to interact with each other. And in fact, if you guys don't start asking each other questions, I'm just going to awkwardly sit there until you do. Once they start understanding that you have the buckets, they did enough preparation to kind of understand that area, but they're still going to be held accountable for just having an authentic conversation. And then when they start pushing each other back and forth on questions, that's when you get kind of the magic where it's a real authentic conversation. But still, the people had the time to prepare for those general topics and provide, really interesting insights or pieces or empirical data points that are actually correct, because they knew where the conversation was generally going to go. And then the last thing is I do agree with Ryan big time that breaking the ice is a big deal. People are nervous. General officers are very nervous on podcasts. If you didn't know, they still get nervous, and they don't know each other. And so we have 15 to 20 minutes of admin time before we hit record, where ostensibly I'm just going over some logistics, but really what I'm doing is like trying to get them to laugh and get comfortable and maybe tell each other a couple stories. So when the real podcast starts, they already feel a little bit comfortable.
Hey, real quick with that's a great point. Like the warm up, especially if you've got like people that aren't used to doing podcasts. Like the last one I did with General George was in his office, and they brought me in like 15 minutes early just to warm General George up. And he was like, let me show you my notebook. And so he went in his desk and got this notebook out from when he was at field grade that he started writing his lessons learned in. And he would go back as a brigade commander, division commander, and reference that notebook. Didn't even know he had it. Didn't know that was something he did. And so then that became like one of the highlights of that episode was him talking about that. So again, if you can get time on the front end, you may discover something that you completely missed in your research that'll make a great point in the show.
So I'll just say from my perspective, that's what's great is we have so many different perspectives on here on how to prepare. Like for me, I do a lot of preparation. I meet with every single guest before they come on, even if it's a panel. I've done, panels up to 3 to 4 people, and I meet with each of them, get an understanding of like where they're coming from, especially on topics they're bringing to the table that I've never done anything with. It gives me an opportunity to get some pre-questions, so it helps me to understand it and helps me to go, okay, I need to go do this research on the topic. And then I'll give them ahead of time, hey, this is our list of topics / questions. This is what we're going to be going over, but always be ready for follow-up questions. I've had some leaders come in, they want to be very scripted, and I tried pulling them away, and it's like fighting with them to get off of it. And those have been some of my more worst podcasts in a sense, because you can tell it's them reading from a script, and then when I ask them a question, they don't know what to do. And that's always a frustrating thing. So like, hey, don't come scripted, be ready. And then one of the things I do on the day of the podcast, I bring them in, like we'll just joke around a little bit, and I'll always read through the beginning of how I'm going to introduce everybody. That's the only thing that I, in a quote unquote script, is my introduction, just so I can introduce, hey, there's any announcements and their bios, making sure I cover that correctly. And it gives them a chance to warm up. I let them hear what they sound like first. And I say, okay, we're cutting that. Let's start from the top. And then that just kind of eases them. And that's what's been successful for me.
Hi, I'm just looking to see, what do you guys have in terms of processes and norms to improve the podcast, either internally or from external sources? So do you kind of have a lot of internal mechanisms, or do you take mostly your criticism from outside the podcast and improve that way?
It's a good question. It's just a tough one for me because I've been doing it so long that it's like so much of it is instinctual. But I'll talk. So we have other shows too. We have 9 other shows besides the main War on the Rocks podcast. Most of them are behind a paywall. And we do have a lot of internal staff conversations about that. And a lot of it is really just about getting people to relax a little more, going through the sort of fake rehearsal interviews with people to coach them on things that are instinctual for me, but not instinctual for them. And, we look at numbers, but we're not really numbers driven. Like it's nice when an episode gets a lot more listeners, but it's not what's important for us. But it's a good question. And if you start a podcast, you should probably have a better answer than I just did.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say what we do during the admin time. We cover a few things every time, and it really helps set the conditions for success, I think. We explain to them in detail who the audience is so they know who they're talking to. And every time we get, hey, thank you for saying that. Like, because, you'll send them an email, but they're not really going to fully read the email, but they like to understand who they're talking to. We check the communications just to make sure it sounds okay. And then the most important thing I think we do is we set the conditions for them to interact with each other, which leads to an authentic conversation, which is actually pretty hard. I don't know why it's so hard to get people to interact with each other. It'd be easier if we could all go get a beer the night before and knew each other. So it probably just has to do with like awareness of each other and trust. But we have a lot of mechanisms in place telling them, literally what I do now is if they aren't interacting within the first 3 minutes and responding to each other, I just tell them to do it. I take an admin file and say, like, you're going to respond to that him or her now. And then they start doing it. And I think that's what leads to the authentic conversations, which I think we've all said is a key, like authentic, interesting conversations, not scripted stuff.
I think the biggest thing for me is just like, I've learned a lot of lessons in real time, and then you try not to repeat them moving forward. Like, I thought, when I first started, was that like you would release a podcast and then you edit it, and then you record it, you edit it, and then you release it, and then you do the next one. I didn't understand the importance of keeping a vault going just in case life happens, just in case your guest cancels, just in case you get sick, just in case your guest is so terrible that you're like, no one will ever listen to this episode again. And so that's happened to only like a handful of times in recording it. But I think the biggest thing is like, as you make mistakes along the way is just keep note of them and then try to do it differently the next time.
I'd say on your point, Joe, that's why I try to keep like a month ahead of time, so that if something happens, like when we had to go through the shutdown, thankfully we were able to keep going because I had that bench of episodes ready to go.
Yeah, what was awesome, a couple of things, like when Putin invaded Ukraine, we just kept releasing episodes while I was like sleeping on the floor of a arena in Poland, because I had a bank built up, or like I was at a CTC rotation as a battalion commander, getting my butt kicked while episodes were still coming out. So again, if you can just build up that bank, it's going to take a whole load of stress off you when it comes to releasing them on a regularly schedule.
We have time for another question, Ellen? Okay.
Finke. And thank you for being here. Okay. My question to you is, in the past few years, we saw a really large influx of podcasts varying in quality. Did you feel the need to innovate or change to keep yourself set apart? I know, Mr. Byerly, you mentioned consistency was your key. Could you other gentlemen please comment on that?
I think it's just about maintaining the core quality. The product that we had in the beginning was unique. So like having a gap is probably important. There have been a few podcasts that have like almost exactly tried to replicate what we tried to do. One of them like wasn't even just like, they like, we're going to bring on a scholar and a practitioner and talk about regular warfare. I was like, what the fuck, dude? But they didn't have, unfortunately for them, good for us, they didn't have like the talented host. So it was like really hard to listen to. But I think at the end of the day, like if you're providing a good product, it's just actually the challenge is maintaining quality as, you know, people have to move on from hosting, like some of us are trying to do. It's just about maintaining that quality, in my opinion, especially if you already have a built-up audience. And then the second aspect would be the place where you need to evolve. I don't think is, in our case at least, is not the product you're providing. It's actually how you amplify that and make sure you're reaching like new target audiences, not just your existing one, which we already talked about. We're going to move into short form video this year to make sure we're continuing to reach new people, but we're not going to change the end product, which is this hour-long podcast that has the same structure for 6 years.
I'll answer it from the perspective of someone like that might be starting a podcast who's not me, because I think we're kind of a bad example for this, because we were the first national security podcast. We built an audience when it was much easier to build an audience. It's very hard to build audience now compared to then, and we're sort of entrenched, which is nice. And but if I was not me and I was starting a new show, I wouldn't think about it, you know, responding to competition once the show's already started. I would do kind of a gap analysis of what exists. What doesn't exist? Where can I jump into the conversation and have something new and different? You know, when we launched Net Assessment, which we ran for years and we just gave it away to the Stimson Center, one of the things was like, well, you don't want it just to be another version of War on the Rocks. So let's have a format. War on the Rocks has no format. It's just us talking, right? But they do how their lives are. Then they have an article that they engage with and, you know, debate between themselves. And then they do airing of grievances and attaboys. So, you know, it's just different ways of thinking about it. So I would, if you're going to look at starting a show one day, I would just be like, all right, what's out there? What isn't? And what can I fill that space? And how can I fill that space in terms of what your special knowledge is, what the focus is, what the format is, dissemination strategy. Once you have that, you know, you do want to be able to adapt to change, but I wouldn't adapt based on what the competitors are doing. Like, don't sweat the competitors. And also don't think about them as competitors so much, because there's so many conversations that are worth having. I never, when people ask what's your competition at War on the Rocks, I say no one, not because I'm arrogant, but because I think of it as who makes money the same way as because War on the Rocks is a commercial enterprise. And who's like edging into our market opportunity. And we have a very unique mix of our revenue strategy. When it comes to content, I don't feel like we have competition, not because we're doing better, but because there's just so much out there. Like, someone else being successful in this space doesn't take anything away from me, and vice versa. So, you know, great ideas, great voices, especially in this community, national security profession of arms, they're ubiquitous. And if you could be someone that helps capture some of that, that's great. And it's a win for everyone. It's a rising tide floats all boats situation.
Any closing thoughts from the panelists?
Yeah, I would just say, again, going back to equipment, like, you can spend a ton of money on podcast equipment. When I first started, I just got a USB mic and I was using my laptop cam, and it was like, so I paid like what, like $20-30. And then over time, once I was like, I actually enjoy doing this. I like putting the work in. I like recording these episodes. I invested a little bit more money in my mic and a soundboard. And then eventually, because of the video aspect of it, invested a little bit more money in a camera and some lighting. And so, and then some DJI mics so I could do stuff on the road. But don't go all in. Like, you can do it. You can start out very cheap. And then once you understand that, like, you have a good product in terms of like the host and the discussions and all that stuff, and you've started building an audience and building momentum, then I would actually invest in more expensive equipment.
If you saw my recording situation, you'd be pretty impressed. You know how like a lot of recording studios have those foam walls and they deflect reverberation and stuff. I go upstairs and raid my kids' beds for all the blankets I can get because that absorbs the audio echo. And my like desk is stacked with them, and my guests have no clue like the jerry rig situation, but great audio quality. I have two closing thoughts if you're thinking about starting a podcast, whether you're a branch or not. First, the potential for impact and influence you can have, especially if you have a defined niche community and you're filling a gap, as Ryan said, is just absolutely momentous. Like I've been shocked at how much influence the podcast has been able to have within our community. But I would be aware that it's extremely challenging to do it right. There are way, way, way more podcasts out there than there are successful podcasts for all the reasons that have been iterated. And I would be extremely cautious to make sure you've had a deliberate plan and you've gone through all the steps to make sure it'll be successful. And especially if you are in the military, you have to have the strength to be willing to hand that off to somebody, knowing that it may die after you leave or it may completely transform after you leave. So huge rewards if you get it right, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not just getting behind a mic and having a random conversation with somebody.
Just one quick I think it's funny anyway, equipment story. First few years we did the podcast, this was pre-Serial. Serial really popularized the podcast format in a big way for the younger people in the audience. But we just used a little like handheld recorder and put it on a table. It's like smaller than my hand. It had a little stand. And we got invited to do one with Secretary of Defense Ash Carter years ago. And you walk in the Pentagon, go into his office, sit down. They're like, well, do you need some time to set up your equipment? And I just go, oh. And I put it on there like, that's it. You could see them looking nervously around like maybe we invited the wrong guy. You can't get away with that anymore. You have to have good equipment, and we do now. But in the early days, it was more like the Wild West.
So I just want to, take this moment to really thank you all, gentlemen, for coming out today and just really giving us so much wisdom when it comes to podcasting, hearing each of your stories on what got you motivated, and some of the challenges you overcame to get your podcast where it is today. And as I'll say, when we close out, like for somebody out there looking to start one, reach out to people who have done podcasts, reach out to gentlemen like this who've done one. They will help you through it. They'll give you that wisdom to what they did that worked, when they didn't do, they should have done. Just reach out to somebody who's already done it. Don't go in blind. And like they talked about, focus on what you like, that you're specialized. Don't worry about and get lost in the metrics of like, oh, I need 1 million followers. I need this many downloads. Like if you have a small target audience, so be it. Focus on the quality and the messaging that you're giving to that community, and they're going to appreciate it more. But I hope you all learned something today. I know I learned a ton from all of you and just this conference in general. And if you have the bandwidth, I really highly do suggest trying it out, launching a podcast, because like I said, you won't regret it.
And listen to LOGSTAT while it lasts.
Thanks, sir.
Let's give them another round of applause. So we've achieved our objective. We've all run over time of every panel today. Ellen, any other instructions for us? Let's give Ellen a round of applause. She's done a great job putting this together. General Dubik, any closing remarks for the team? So, I was in the Army for a long time. So I've been out for about 4.5 years now. And we've achieved what we want to achieve at this, but you have to make irreversible momentum so that you continue the conversation beyond this session, right? So we had the T2Com, is really the Army Marketing Command, Commanding General here, and he was talking about how do we market, how do we communicate what the Army is all about. And the best way to do that is by what you guys are doing. So the podcast is just a tool, and I'm feeling a certain kind of way because you didn't ask me. I'm a podcast host. Now, I'm just kidding. And you have reinvigorated my focus on what the Army profession is all about and what you're doing in support of the Army and the nation. And I didn't talk about this earlier, but we are publishing a book this summer called All the Difference. I left copies there if you guys want to take a picture of it. It's 6 leadership actions to bridge perspectives, strengthen teams, and create value. Now, this is a short story really quickly, because I'm telling you this because it came from failure. So I joined a company, a startup that failed. A year. I'm not going to tell you how much money I lost, but I wrote it off. That's another conversation for another day. But the other two people came together and said, there's something unique here. And so it's taken us 2 years to develop this book. And we're already talking about podcasts and what things we're going to do. But that's what you guys are doing. You're taking the people who come to your formations that are different than you, and you're there to create success in what they do. So thank you for what you guys are doing. Please be safe on your transport, and please keep writing. Thank you so much.